Okay, so overall, as I've said before, this has been a phenomenally good project. It's a great design. It's very clearly spelled out what to do. Um, and they thought of everything. Remember, it is not cheating at all to let somebody else pick the colors in a lovely combination. It can give you some insight into how you might want to make different color choices for your own designs, etc. It's also totally not cheating to use somebody else's design, which is what I've done here. And it is not cheating after you've made a bunch of weaving projects like I have. I've been weaving since about 1996. To just stop and go back to something simple. In fact, stopping with the elaborate projects and going back to something simple gives you an opportunity. It gives you an opportunity to work on some basics. So I'm especially glad that I finished this project, and uh, it will, because going back to the basics gave me some ideas about things I've learned and things I want to work on in my next weaving projects. So, what have I learned? First, I have learned that I always, always, always need to add half a yard to my warp length. If I had another half yard, I would have 3 scarves that met a minimum of 74 inches, because that's not what I've got right now. So I think I mentioned this when I finished the first scarf, and then it happened again when I finished the second scarf, that if I wanted to have a symmetrical pattern on the length of the scarf, I had to go past 74 inches. And that meant I didn't have enough warp length left to get this one to 74 inches. I'm about 2.5, 3 inches short. So if I had added half an inch of warp length, or half a yard of warp length to my warping board guide string, I wouldn't have had this problem. Probably, potentially, I could have eked out another repeat or two of the pattern or one more repeat of the pattern, just weaving as is. But I knew from the way the shed was working when I hit this stage of the length of the warp that it wasn't going to be much fun to weave. And here's what I mean by that. When I press on one treadle, I don't get a very clean shed. It's clean-ish, but it's not clean enough. And I would have had to basically fight my way through a messy shed for 2.5 more inches, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that's 40 picks of fighting my way through the shed, and I would not have enjoyed it. And the way you can tell is partly that the shafts that are supposed to be down are sitting about an inch higher than their resting place. And the warp ends at the bottom of the shed are sitting about an inch off the beater bottom. And this was just going to be miserable weaving. There comes a point on every warp length where there just isn't enough leeway. When when the bundles of warp ends are still back at the back beam, yeah, that shed will open up perfectly. It'll be clean, it'll be fantastic. But when those knots are getting closer and closer to the backs of the heddles, it doesn't work as well. So always add half a yard to the warp length beyond what a pattern specifies, or beyond what you've calculated yourself if it's your own design. The amount of yarn you will quote unquote waste is minimal, and the payoff can be huge, especially if, as in this case, I needed to adjust the length of my first 2 scarves, and that gave me a shorter scarf at the end. The second thing I learned, and I knew this, but I didn't do it, the designer did not use floating selvages, and that is something I will change the next time I do this. And I am likely to pick some different colors and just tie on to this warp because I love this pattern so much, and it'll be fun to do it in another set of colors. So twills, because you're always moving one thread over as you weave, and leaving some threads down, it is really, really easy to get draw in on twills. And so I've gotten in the habit of using floating salvages. In fact, I often will use floating salvages on projects that don't even need them, just because it prevents draw in. So I did fine this time, but next time I would get even better salvages if I had floating salvages. And it would be almost impossible for you to see, even if I put the camera right over the spots, where things did not turn out as smoothly because I didn't use them. But it would have made this already fun weaving project even less stressful to have the floating salvages. The next thing I learned is beaming with even tension is the most important thing, especially when it's a longer-ish warp. So this warp length was, I'm looking, 7.5 yards, which for me is a pretty long warp. And that is a long time, even if you're careful, to keep all the tension even. And it really showed up in this third scarf. So if I pat on the left side of the scarf as I'm looking at it, you're not seeing much bounce. If I start moving over, you're seeing more and more bounce. And look how much play I'm getting on the right end of the scarf. This means that at least one of my bundles of warp ends, and probably two of them on the right side of the scarf, are considerably looser than they are on the left side. And that was, again, something I didn't notice until I got to this third scarf, and then I really started to notice it. So beaming with an even tension is the most important thing. And I actually did some new things. I now have little 2-pound hand weights used, for exercise that I attached onto my warp chains as I was beaming the warp. And that made a huge difference, but it didn't make a huge enough difference. So weaving this third scarf, I had to crank up the tension higher than I would have liked. This is part of the reason I think people tend to, when they get on a floor loom, just ratchet up the tension until you can ping the warp ends like a guitar string, because there's obviously always going to be some variation in your tension no matter how well you beam the warp, and cranking up the tension kind of helps even that out. But being more conscious of that as I was working would have made a difference. So what this project also allowed me to do was to work on some really basic stuff that sometimes I'm careless about. I got much better about grabbing the beater in the middle of the beater. When I did the stitches, the repeats on the rightmost treadles, I would grab with my left hand. And when I did the repeats on the leftmost treadles, I would grab with my right hand, but I was still grabbing in the middle. And this good beading as you're weaving is wonderful. I also learned to measure often, especially on this scarf, which had 10 repeats of the 4-row pattern. And in fact, when I redo this pattern, I'm going to start with this treadling, and I can play with treadling, with different treadlings beyond what the designer stipulated in her instructions. So measuring often and advancing the warp often, I got much better at these things as I worked on this project. Another thing I worked on hard, even with my end delivery shuttle, was watching these salvages, keeping an eye on them. And again, if I had done the floating salvage, this would have been even easier. I reminded myself how important it is to wind perns well, because I had a couple of sections on the last 2 perns I wound where there were just loose threads. And when you are using an end delivery shuttle and you can't just pull the yarn easily off, it will catch on the selvage you start from and start pulling stuff in. So winding perns is a really good thing to practice. Just wind some perns. It's never a bad thing. Because you have to tension as you're winding the pern, and you want to make sure that you do not ever go back go backwards. You always want to wind the pern from the wide end down to the narrowest in tiny sections. And once you've filled in that section, you stop and you go to the next section. Otherwise, things can get bad. And when the yarn is not tight around the pern and it loosens up, that's when you get into problems. So rather than fight with the pern, I actually wound off sections that were bad and just cut the yarn and threw it away, which I don't love to do. Finally, what this project reminded me of, and this is perhaps an even bigger thing because I just discovered the We Do Not Care movement on YouTube, and if you haven't seen it before, look it up, you'll love it. There are lots and lots of tiny details in weaving, and some of them matter. Some of them matter a lot in the sense of they will make or break the structural integrity of the fabric you are weaving, or they will be really, really visible errors. And some of the details are just not that important. What tends to be most important is all the stuff in the middle of the weaving. So if there's a mistake from like this, from this burgundy warp to the burgundy warp here, that will be really noticeable. But what's going on at the edges, much less noticeable. So when I had I had a couple of bad ends, and I still don't know how this happened, but they just kept breaking and breaking and breaking right here in the last dent of my reed. And after repairing those broken warp ends 3 or 4 times, I finally just said, forget it. I cut them off, and nobody except me would ever know that I did that because they're right here on the very edge. So figure out what details you should really pay attention to and what you can let go. And again, this will enhance your weaving pleasure. So kudos to this designer, kudos to whoever made these color choices. This is a delightful set of scarves, and I look forward to tying on a new set of colors almost certainly. Yeah, you guessed it. It's going to be in blues, and I'm going to reuse this light gold because it's so pretty. And I might do a gray with it. So these aren't the actual yarns I would use. This is actually a different project. But these colors could all work really well together. Or swap out the gray and put in a coordinating green, like a peacock, a bright peacock bottle green kind of color. And this would be a lovely combination. So there's lots of fun to be had with a basic project.